I'm not even sure if this will actually record. But if you're looking at it, it means it did. This ought to be an interesting conversation. If you don't know who I am, I'm Scott Killaby, and I'm sitting here in the comfort of my own home. This is where I do my talks with people about awakening, and in particular, embodiment of awakening. And the reason I don't normally introduce myself at the beginning of a video, but the reason I'm doing it here is that many of you receive, or some of you maybe, receive this video from a friend or somebody who said, maybe watch this. This is interesting, or check this out, or this guy's off his rocker, whatever. In any event, you have it. And that means you're also interested in awakening or non-duality, enlightenment, Eastern practices, meditation, mindfulness. Yeah, because I am a non-dual teacher. You may not know about me. I'm going to ask the people that watch this video, my own audience, to send it to people that don't know me. Whether they will or not, I don't know. Because the title alone might get your interest. It should. Definitely. I'd be paying attention if I were interested in enlightenment or awakening. If I saw a non-dual teacher, which is what I am. I've been a non-dual teacher for over 15 years now. I've written 7 books on non-dual realization. I have founded 2 mindfulness training programs. I train therapists, teachers, anybody who wants to learn this style of inquiry. I say none of that to impress you, because if you know that I'm a non-dual teacher, it doesn't impress me. So why would it impress you? I say that so that you will know that there is some credibility here, that people have been following my work for a long time. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Because I just want you to listen. If you'll just listen, then you don't need to know that I have credibility. Isn't that the thing about listening? We think we need to know that somebody knows what they're talking about to listen. That they've learned it somewhere, that they're trained or whatever. The truth is, I have experience, direct experience. This is where I've learned all this. One thing that made me different as a teacher is that I spent virtually all of my time in one-on-one sessions with the students of my work. I did groups too, probably as many as a lot of other teacher groups. But I spent my days, every day, in fact, sometimes 4 and 5 sessions a day, for roughly 15 years, a lot of sessions with people. And I mean on every continent, almost every country. Well, there's some countries that are just not developed enough to have people interested in this, but a lot of different countries across the world, different cultures, ages, a true cross-section, I think, of humanity. So I've learned some things that I don't think other teachers know, maybe. They haven't really learned it the way that I learned it, because they didn't sit for so long with people one-on-one and just get into what makes their, like mindfulness and inquiry, sort of like getting into their world, in their head, and seeing what they believe. So I saw, more than anything else as a teacher, I saw the bypass, I think, more than other teachers saw. Now, what made me see it other than other teachers? Well, because, see, these people, you guys who are following these teachings and teachers, you follow the pointers, right? And then you have these experiences or whatever, and then you reach out to someone like me because it feels off or something, or it's like something is missing in or you're suffering, like in some cases really, really suffering, people, even after being exposed to these teachings. In any event, so many people reached out to me through the years as a teacher. It's like they were thirsty to talk to somebody who wasn't just on a camera pointing to awareness. They wanted flesh and blood. They wanted to be able to talk. They wanted to find out the down and dirty on it. So I did that, and I spent countless hours with people. I mean, like I said, maybe 14,000 sessions, something like that. So I have a different perspective, I think, than other non-dual teachers. I think that I definitely do. Clearly, I do. Because I feel like I've just been in the trenches with you all. I feel like there hasn't been that much of me kind of behind the throne, like a lot of teachers do, where you sit up here and you just don't connect really with people. You don't really get to know them. You don't ask questions and they don't get to know you. A lot of the teachers are like that. They don't share much. That's one of my main criticisms, by the way, and why I think it's a, I don't know what the word is I'm going to use. It's fucked up, say it that way, that we teachers don't offer more about ourselves. Like that's a big problem, actually. And I think that comes from trauma and repression, which is another one of my criticisms, is that in non-duality, trauma and emotional repression aren't being dealt with, and that creates a bypass. I'm not going to get there yet, because you don't know. If those of you who are watching my videos, you are just stumbling on this video, you don't know about all that yet. You don't know about my criticisms. We're not getting there yet. I'm going to start with something simple here. Is the fact that you don't know much about your teachers is the biggest problem. Maybe one of the biggest. Because, see, people got to know me through the years. And then I would come on camera because I was doing inquiry myself. I whatever process that I developed, I always did that process because to me, that's what spirituality is about. It's an exploration. And it's not like that is so boring to me to just be a teacher and to teach other people. And I think it would be arrogant, I think, if I didn't process my own stuff. It certainly would. So the whole time I've been a teacher, I've processed my own stuff. There's a footnote to that because I bypassed anger. And so I have to take responsibility for that. But otherwise, other than the fact that I was terrified of anger, it's true. I process my stuff, and I always have. In other words, I didn't take the route that some teachers do. And I interviewed teachers when I first became a teacher because I wanted to know. I wanted to get to know them, and I didn't feel like that you knew anything about these people. So I did a bunch of interviews with the teachers, and what I found out is that some of them processed their stuff and some didn't. And then, more than I would like to admit, didn't. What I learned from interviewing all those teachers, and something that I used to call the Kilo Logs, it was a set of interviews that I did. I was disheartened and stopped interviewing them actually at a certain point when I realized the majority of them didn't seem to continue to process. And they seemed to be running some version of, and I was too, some version of, but it wasn't overt, some version of I'm done. Again, but it wasn't explicit. None of us were saying that. None of us in those interviews would say, I'm done. I don't know about you. Are you done? I mean, I'm fully liberated. I'm fucking perfect, actually. I'm so awake that I don't do anything that you would even think would be unconscious. Like, I'm really perfect. Nobody says that. What happens is that it's implied in the way that someone speaks or points. The ego is implied in that, you could say. The I'm done, that I'm beyond it all, in a way, is implied in that. Because there's actually no harm in continuing to process. It's actually really beneficial. But, people stop. They don't process their own stuff for various reasons. And what I learned is one of the reasons here, I learned it early on, one of the reasons that teachers don't continue to process is because they, in one way or another, they think they're done. Okay, that's a big problem right there. But I didn't see it as a problem back then. I was only focused on just processing my own stuff. I wasn't interested in, by the way, I was in repression. Remember, anger repression. So when you're in anger repression, you really don't want to mention stuff like that in an interview or otherwise, because your whole operating system is peace. Don't rock the boat. Don't say that. So I didn't. I just noticed it. And I just internally just took note of it. Why are all these teachers implying that they're done? Should I just be implying that I'm done? It was one of those things. Like, why am I processing stuff? Then I met teachers who would process some stuff, and I really liked them. Their energy. I finally met them. And that's like, I want that. And so I'm going to continue processing, because this person, whenever I would meet people who would process their own stuff, they felt fresh. It felt like they weren't just repeating memorized concepts, non-dual concepts. It's just like they were being themselves more in some way. And the greatest teacher that I met along the way that I felt was really themselves is Greg Good. Above all of the teachers that I met, he's the one that stood out and I just can't even put him with the others. It's just really different. But otherwise, I met a bunch of teachers. Also, Ken Wilber, I have to put him out because he didn't show up that way. But they process their own stuff, Greg Good and Ken Wilber. They have a practice. And I've worked really intimate with Greg. Well, as much as you can over the internet for quite a long time, actually. And I got to meet Ken Wilber and talk to him. We sat down. And once I met those people, I gained confidence about what I was doing. Ken Wilber is known as the Einstein of consciousness, and Greg Good is astute and well-versed in many spiritual traditions and also awake. These were the two teachers that I felt really came in and changed me in ways that they don't even really realize probably. But the rest of the teachers that I saw, I had problems with them. The more that I stopped doing the interviews and problems, what I mean with them, it's like I didn't see that kind of integrity in a lot of them. It's like you couldn't, just to get the information out of them, do you still process, was like trying to suck blood from a turnip sometimes. It's like they weren't really open about whether that was really happening. And I just didn't connect with those people, is what it was. For whatever reason. Because I wanted to process my own stuff, and I didn't understand why they didn't, and I wasn't happy with their answers. Like, do you have any stuff? The vague answers and the pointing back to awareness and impersonalizing things and not talking about their home life or their relationship and all that. Like, some of these people were like this even off the stage. They wouldn't give you anything. They were like a robot. And I vowed to myself, I don't want to become that. Whatever happening for them, where they can't be human, or they can't just talk about human things, or like drag queens, or masturbation, or Baywatch, then I'm not interested in that. I don't want the realization, whatever you have, where you can't enjoy life, or you can't just be a person also. I don't want that. That's what I learned. So again, I became drawn to the people that I thought, the teachers that I thought were really doing the work and showing up in a way that was attractive for me. But I was still in anger repression. And what I learned along the way is there was a lot of bypassing going on. But I was totally doing it at that time. I've been a teacher a long time. And I came into this bypassing conversation around 2010 or 11. But I was totally lost as to what it was all about. After doing all those interviews with people and working with teachers and working with all these students, there was obviously this big issue that I saw early, and I kept seeing it, which was that the teachers were saying one thing, pointing in a certain way, but the vast majority of the people weren't really waking up. Some people were, but it still seemed really rare. And what was even more rare was actually embodying that and not bypassing. I became interested in that topic, but I couldn't decode it. I couldn't get under why this bypass seemed to be so big and why was everybody doing it and what was it all about. Well, I come to find out later it was about the anger repression. It's about repression and trauma. And this is Ken Wilber's criticism, by the way, of the entire thing, is that there's unprocessed trauma, repression, and shadows running these Eastern practices and these teachers. And he's so right. He's just so right about that. It just took me a long time to see what it was, though, because it's hidden. And so when you first come, you don't really know what's going on. It's all very, very unconscious. And I had to be here a long time to figure it out. So what's going on? What's going on? There's a lot of people here that are really afraid, but they won't admit it. And I was one of them. When I say afraid, I mean afraid to go all the way with awakening, which means to heal. And I'm talking about healing trauma and reversing the emotional repression that goes with trauma. I tried very hard to bypass, just like so many teachers and so many people, because I also didn't want to feel anger, obviously. So my bypass was all about avoiding anger and a few other things. What I've learned is that the bypass is whatever you're repressing, that your primary repression is your bypass. I've also learned that your primary repression, in other words, whether it's anger or sadness that you hold back, not only is it your primary repression, what you repress the most, but the reason that you bury it is that that emotion or those traits are scarier than other emotions and traits. So there's more resistance to what we bury, is what I learned over time. So I actually learned over time that what I had buried and never gotten to as a teacher was my main identification. And they don't tell you that because there's a lot of bypassing in spirituality. The reason that teachers don't tell you that their main identification is buried is because their main identification is buried, a lot of them. I learned that through the interviews, but I couldn't pinpoint it until I ended the bypassing in myself. Because it's an unconscious thing. You know that something is off, but you can't see it because you are it. You're identified with it. This is why I'm no longer identified with it, and I'm talking about it, and and it ruffles feathers. Because there are people still, teachers and otherwise, who are still identified with it. And when I start talking about it, that ego that's identified with the repression gets upset. And I've heard about it from teachers and students who are self-protecting around the trauma. But I did. Let me talk about myself first. I got really sick. I'm not going to tell this whole story, but I got 3 diseases after the awakening. So this was a serious bypass. And then the 3rd disease was spinal stenosis, severe chronic pain. And I got to the point of suicidal ideation. I mean, I really wanted to die because the pain was so great. And unbeknownst to me, the reason that it was there is because I had avoided anger so much on my spiritual path that I had stored it in my spine. Come to find out later, although I can't prove it because many of the teachers are not actually open, there's a lot of other teachers with diseases, chronic pain, spinal issues, who also were bypassing. And that's another sore subject. I'm not supposed to talk about that. I've been told that we don't talk about that because it's repression and people are hiding is what the real reason is we don't talk about this. People are afraid. But what happens in the spiritual community is people couch it in different terms. So they'll say, no, a trauma is an illusion or something. No, it's not actually. It's very real for people who have it. It actually runs all suffering. Now, everything is an illusion. But see what we're doing? This is one of my biggest complaints right here, is discovering that the root of suffering, like trauma, like science has been telling us in the last 10 years, us teachers, that trauma and repression is behind a great deal of suffering. But instead of dealing with that, and this is one of the reasons why I just want to separate myself from the pack of teachers, because there's a lot of teachers who will deny the need to include trauma and repression into the awakening piece, which is absolutely ridiculous. Well, it makes total sense, though, because that's the source of the bypass. That's why there's so much resistance to bringing trauma and repression work in, is because we've been playing it safe, a lot of us here in spirituality, not really getting to the root of suffering, and in fact bypassing. And denying it, and getting mad when somebody talks about it, like me. Well, I'm at to the point now where I don't care. Like, I really don't care. You have no idea how much I don't care about whether people don't like this. Because I've learned that you have to actually keep talking in the face of repression. Because if you don't, the repression, out of fear, will just keep trying to shut you down. You have to keep saying something when people are in trauma. You can't go quiet because their trauma has a hold of them. And so you have to just keep speaking. That's what I've learned. Because that's how I've helped a lot of people who follow my work get out of the bypass. It's just relentlessly coming on camera and talking about the bypass and the avoidance and the repression and trauma and how we're hiding from it. And I think that now Dan McClintock and I have developed work that corrects this bypass. Okay, well, I'm not going to get into that, what that means by correcting the bypass, but it essentially means it's reversing the emotional repression and healing the trauma along the way, since that's the root of suffering. according to science. The root of suffering is that. So the awakening is now going to include that. The embodiment of the presence, which means bringing awareness all the way down into where the body's keeping the score on the old childhood stuff that's running the suffering. This stuff is very, very unconscious. That's one of the issues here, is that this stuff is so unconscious that it doesn't just arise to awareness. So one of my big beefs, my criticisms of myself previously as a teacher and other teachers, is how that we imply to people that everything that needs to be seen will arise to awareness. If they'll just rest as the awareness that they really are, they'll see everything come and go and they'll wake up. But that just didn't happen for the majority of people that I met with, because the fact of the matter remains, which the teachers don't tell you, because a lot of them don't know, is that the repression and the trauma conditioning creating all the suffering, that conditioning itself doesn't arise to awareness. So all we've been doing, essentially, it took me a long time to find out, all we've been really doing in awakening teachings is essentially regulating the nervous system with regard to safe phenomena that arises to awareness. I can't call that an awakening. You could, in that, you might shift to like the recognition that you're the witnessing presence, and that there's like a witnessing awareness. But that's been touted as the awakening by many of the teachers, and I don't agree. And here's why. I don't want to disagree, but integrity calls for it, and here's why. So that's a bypass, is what I learned. Because see, if your main identification is buried, if the anger that is the scariest thing for you, or the fear or whatever is just buried, you can't say you're awake, because your main identification is still buried. So, I mean, yeah, you can say you're awake if you want, but it doesn't change the fact that your main identification is buried. The thing that's actually creating most of the suffering, is still buried. How do we get away with that? By burying it, so that we pretend like it's not happening, and then bypassing. We just bury our head in the sand. What anger? One teacher said, I'm not going to get angry for probably another 20 years, probably. Or hurt, or something else is buried, sadness that just never got dealt with. It's a fucking scandal once you really see it. It's a scandal, but the sad thing about it is the people that are perpetrating the scandal don't even know it, because they're afraid, and they're hiding from something themselves. So you can't even say, for most of them, you can't even say you have the intent to harm people, because they don't even know it. They're doing it. Because that's how unconsciousness is. You know not what you do. And I didn't either. So what are we doing as teachers? We're leading others into avoidance, because we're in avoidance. And here's about when I start getting the emails that say, well, my teacher doesn't avoid and he's fully liberated. But I can guarantee that if your teacher is fully liberated, he doesn't need you to defend him or her. And the fact that you're defending them is actually, you're not defending your teacher. You're defending something that you buried in your body, that you're protecting. And chances are your teacher was protecting it and burying it also. That's why you chose your teacher, so that neither one of you would have to feel that. And now when I come and criticize, I'm getting too close to what you buried in your body. But see, some of you are protecting your teacher. You're making it as if I'm picking on your teacher. But I never mention teachers' names. So the feeling that being picked on your teacher is you protecting what? Not your teacher. Remember, they don't need that. It's you protecting your repression. What you buried. When I start to criticize the teacher that helped you bypass, it gets too close to that. Now, you'll tell yourself it's something else that you're upset with me about. But we have to be honest here, because you're not willing to go into the unconscious and see what's driving you. So you get to lie to yourself and tell you that what's driving you is that you just need to go defend your teacher. But what's really happening is that you're defending yourself and what you don't want to feel. And by the way, I get some backlash from some of your teachers who also don't want to feel this. And also, I didn't want to either. And if you would have come to me 8 years ago, I would have also, in one way or another, denied it. Because I had to stay safe. So it's not a scandal being perpetrated by people who are conscious. It's not that kind of a scandal or scam. It's a scandal being run by people who are afraid and who don't know what they're doing. The fear has them, and there's unconsciousness to the extent that they don't know what they're doing. I didn't know what I was doing. I was trying to avoid. As long as you have repression, that is your agenda. I didn't understand that. I thought I was wanting to wake up and be free. No, that's not how trauma works. I had an operating system that was just wanting to stay safe and get love and hold self back and then be free on top of that. But you can't do that. It doesn't work. That's too safe. But that's what I see the majority of the teachers doing. There's definitely some good ones out there, the ones that I named and others. But if you guys would just stop defending them, stop protecting them, and start doing your deep somatic work is what I suggest. Stop defending. It's not going to help you. Not on this path. Okay, so for those of you who are just seeing this video, what do you do with that if the bypass is real? And it is. But don't believe me. Come into KI and discover it. We'll show it to you. Exactly how it works. We've decoded the whole thing. But there'll be some of you who are watching this and you just don't like what I'm saying. Well, that's just going to be part of it too. Is that, okay, here's the other thing. I'm not interested in you liking me. Truthfully. And that might make me unattractive, actually, to say that as a teacher, to say something like that. That might just be a little off-putting right off the bat, but I just need to be honest. I am not interested in it. I know who my friends are. I have my circle of friends. I have my partner. Those are my relationships. Those are the people that I've invested in, I'm connected with. I don't know you. And I just want to be really honest from the beginning. We may never really get to know each other. We may or we may not. The reason I'm saying that is because I want you to not focus on me. If you come to KI, I want you to focus on yourself and your work. And that's what I'm doing. By the way, that's what I did to come out of anger repression. I continue to process my stuff. And I'm just going to process my stuff. I'm going to ask you to process your stuff because that's exactly what hasn't gone on out there. That's why we're focusing on that. Is because it just isn't going on out there very much. In terms of the teachers, unfortunately, that has spilled over to some of the practitioners who listen to the teachers, and some of the teachers say, there's nothing that you need to do. There's nobody here. You just recognize that there's a presence here. There's nobody here in that presence, or that there's just presence. And then you're free. And so people pick that up. Do you know why they pick that up? One reason is because then they don't have to feel scary shit. That's safer. I'll take that instead of the buried stuff. So we're drawn to safe things. So we create, or we listen to these stories of enlightenment or pointing, and the thing that seems most like it's going to give us what we want, which is the not to feel that. See? It's a promise. Like if you recognize this, you won't have to deal with that. Or in some way, you won't suffer anymore, right? But what I found with so many of the teachings is, see, instead of just saying that and then going away like so many teachers did, that's what we do. We say stuff, but then we don't necessarily meet with people and see what's really going on with them. So instead of just saying stuff like that, I would start meeting with people. One-on-one. A lot of people. And come to find out, they were using what we were saying to avoid their emotions. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. They're using what we're saying to avoid emotions. Well, we must not be clear. Like I'm not avoiding emotions. This is how fucking crazy it is. Because I was literally not only avoiding emotions, but leading people in it, like all these other teachers, but not taking any responsibility. And then just looking at them like, oh, God, yeah, you really don't get it. It's so awful. to shadow that out like that. The truth of the matter is, I had buried anger and they had buried emotion, all the people I was working with, and so had many of the teachers, and that we had all had developed this way of pointing to awareness in which none of us had to deal with it. And slowly I started to catch on to that through the years. And I also started to notice that science was studying it and has been studying it. And now we know that trauma and repression drive chronic pain, disease, mental health, suffering. So it all made sense as to what we were missing here in spirituality. It's the buried stuff that is driving it all, according to science. And here we don't really get to the buried stuff quite often, because what we're doing a lot of is just resting as awareness, not digging up buried stuff, but resting as what's already awake here. And then the buried stuff doesn't come. And so what is that? What happens then? When the buried stuff doesn't come up, then you have teachers getting sick. A lot of them. You just don't hear about it all. It's part of the secrecy. We don't always talk about it, but you still hear about some of it. And so there's a lot of sickness coming because we've missed trauma and repression. There's a lot of sickness in the people that follow the work. It's just you don't know about it. I know about it because I worked with so many of you. But see, you guys don't talk to each other. So here are us teachers, and look at the number of teachers who got sick. You should take a look at the percentage. And now extrapolate that out towards everybody following the work. There's a lot of people sick. And this is what we're dealing with here, is that there's this almost like an epidemic in a way that's running things, and people are getting sick. The teachings don't create it. They just don't prevent anything like that from happening. They don't get to the root of the suffering. So you can't really say the teachings cause it. It's just the teachings just come in and help people totally turn away from it, the root of suffering. And then that root of suffering creates disease, like 3 for me after the awakening. And I am not alone. If I could show you right now, if I could bring everybody that I worked with here with me in unison, you would hear how many of us are sick. It's a lot. Or chronic pain or something, or some other bypassed issue that is created issues, including addiction, mental health. So all that changed me. It really did. And so after a while, I started to move away from teaching around 2014, 2015, once I saw the bypass, but I had not decoded it yet. I was living in it. I started to not want to be a teacher. What was happening was the repression was coming up, surfacing. And so that created like an inertia. That's why I talk about it. And inertia is that sense of like, you can't move. Like you want to go do stuff, but you can't. Like you want to start that website, but you don't. Or I want to start working out, but I can't. I want to date, but I'm scared. It's just that kind of thing. And so many people, that's another thing that I learned. Oh my God, I just want to hug all of you. When I learned this about your lives and the effect that these teachings had on your lives, not just the illness, but the inertia. And I noticed that people were dying too along the way. Followers of teachers and teachers quietly just dying from this, in many cases from cancer or some other trauma or repression-based thing. Well, I didn't leave teaching. I just got really quiet as a teacher. And then I got sick. I got really sick the 3rd time. Chronic pain, severe nerve pain, and then led to suicidal ideation, which I told you. The point is I dropped all of the non-dual pointers at that point, all of it. And I recreated a set of inquiries for myself that would reverse the repression that was behind all that. And then that changed everything for me. Sorry, I just took a break and did a little walk. I'm out of breath. So it changed everything. The chronic pain was healed. I'm doing better than ever. There's a flow in my life. There's enthusiasm and inspiration. There's joy for the first time because that was with a buried anger. I'm doing really well, actually, and so ready to help so many people. Ready. However many people that want to come. But I wasn't always ready for that. Now, here's where it gets juicy. Is this work KI right for you? I can't answer that. But I'll tell you one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be honest with you. What I'm about to share is not absolute truth. So don't be fooled into thinking that. What I'm sharing with you is a perspective from a non-dual teacher who's been involved in this for a long time. Get out. Get out while you can. Or if you can't get out, upgrade your skill. And when I say get out, what I mean is get out of any pattern where you're using spiritual techniques to further store the emotion. Because some of the worst cases that I saw after I started to work with people with repression were with long-term practitioners and meditators who had cultivated such silence that they buried the unconscious mind that had stored the anger or the sadness. They just buried it. And when it came time to retrieve that unconscious mind to come out of repression, they couldn't. Leave. Okay, that's not so easy though, because some of these practices we've become addicted to. And that's part of the issue, is that where addiction starts to sink in on the seeking path, repression is running it. So some of us are in these cycles where we're practicing regularly and we can't extricate ourselves because we're keeping safe from the practice. So that feeling of like, no, I can't stop, is that. Or the feeling it would be difficult for me to just stop my practice. Because that's the repression, because if that practice is giving you something, it's keeping you safe in some way. It has to be, because there's no practice in and of itself that's addictive. It's the nervous system of the person doing it. So if you have repression or trauma, as science says, that can make spiritual practice addictive. It can also make seeking addictive and all that. Okay, but what do you do with this information? The thing I'll say to you is keep it simple. One way you can just counter this is to learn KI. Just learn this work and stop thinking about it. Because once you learn it, we'll show all this to you in your direct experience, and you'll see that trauma and repression is driving all suffering. You won't need science, and when the teachers say that something else is driving suffering, you'll go, because you'll know better. See, that's the whole thing, is empowering yourself. Is what I want to help people do, is empower themselves with knowledge. So step outside of your spiritual bubble and start reading science. Start reading the link between emotional repression, trauma, and disease. Emotional repression, trauma, and chronic pain. Emotional repression, trauma, and mental health. That will educate your mind. And then read Bessel van der Kolk and other leading trauma researchers. There's a list of them. Educate yourself about what trauma is. Thomas Hübl is one of my favorites. There are definitely others. If you want a full list, come to the members area, and we have a list there. Many of us have read these books. I also recommend anything from Dr. John Sarno, who changed the entire landscape about treating chronic pain by showing people, just like the science says, that it's actually coming from emotional repression. And then Alan Gordon, A Way Out. These are all books that influence this. And anything from Ken Wilber, especially Integral Spirituality. Also anything from, I just recommend Greg Good stuff because, I'm not going to get into why, but Greg Good is also somebody that I think you can trust in this area. Because these are people who get it in some way. They process their stuff. Their teaching in the world includes that. So you're not going to see the same kind of bypassing from them. Okay, so that's what I say first, is just go read. Go learn that the real root of suffering is trauma and repression. If you don't learn it, see, our minds have already bamboozled ourselves out of this. That's the problem with repression. We are hiding the fact that this is the root of the suffering. It's unconscious. So strangely, as a teacher, even though I'm sitting here sharing about being awake, like so many other teachers, I didn't know that I had that. So I was doing the bypassing as a teacher, not knowing it. I had to actually go outside of my own teaching, my own understanding, and learn that I was mistaken, that I was wrong. So I'm inviting everybody on the spiritual path to understand that if you don't see that trauma and repression are actually the root of the suffering, then you're wrong. I don't know how else to say it, because you're pretending you're doing something else, which is keeping you safe that way. And that's what I was doing for years, is just avoiding this fact. Well, now there's science, so it's much, much harder to avoid it. The spiritual bypass, to define it, is very simple. It's, I don't want to feel something. And that's the repression. That's the repression mechanism that's buried. I don't want to feel that. So let's seek enlightenment so we don't have to feel that. I don't want to feel that. So let me identify with this story, which has these other emotions and doesn't have the buried thing. See? So the buried emotion is like there's programming with it. I don't want to feel the buried thing. I don't want to. So your whole path is being run by avoidance conditioning that's buried. Your entire path, your life is being run by it. When you sit down on the meditation mat, it's being run by a mechanism that's keeping you safe from the buried stuff. So you never get to the root of suffering when you're being with what is. My God, that's shitty to recognize as a teacher, writing all these books saying, just be with what is. You are the awareness. Come to find out, the root of your suffering is buried, and you can't actually embody the awareness that way. And that's why all these teachers are bypassing and how they are doing it, because we don't realize and we don't read outside of our insulated world. See, many of us teachers, we got our information and pointers from our teacher, and they got it from their teacher, and none of them knew it. Everything was insulated. This is Ken Wilber's criticism. These traditions are insulated from science that could help them see that they're bypassing entire traditions, and stubborn about it. That we teachers can be so stubborn about our bypassing because we're just not as open as we say. You'll see it when you really start asking the hard questions. Okay, so there's so much to say from that. I developed an entirely different path that now gets to the root of the suffering from the beginning. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but essentially we're just turning the entire path inside out so that all the bullshit that we hide from ourselves is revealed in the beginning. And that changes everything, because that's how we're lying to ourselves, by not going into the body and seeing what's really driving us. When we do that in the beginning, now the suffering that happens, we have a shot at seeing what the real root of it is and ending the suffering. But if we lie about what the root of the suffering is, see that? How can we? So those who don't get to the root of suffering, if you'll watch, they're talking about awareness a lot. Look at this dichotomy in the spiritual, the non-dual world. If there's a lot of talk about awareness or emptiness or something where there's like this other concept that's brought in and you're supposed to focus on that, even though that is your true nature, like that concept is pointing to awareness. The awareness that's looking right now, this awareness is what we're talking about, waking up to the presence that's awake right now. That's what I'm talking about in this. That's what we're all the teachers are talking about this. But here's the problem with this. If I sit and focus on this and point to this and have people identify with this awakeness, and I just do that, then what happens is it acts as a gatekeeper to keep the buried stuff down. And basically the buried stuff is just body contraction. So inside the body contractions is the repression and the trauma. But a lot of these teachings are saying, don't dig inside that. Just let the contraction be as it is in awareness. So we're teaching a bypass, literally. We're teaching you how to avoid through spirituality. And you trust us because we're the teachers. Well, one of the biggest problems is that many of the teachers do not take yet responsibility for it. So they just keep pointing to awareness without knowing or addressing the fact that the root of the suffering never arises to awareness. It's buried in the body. So they just keep pointing you back to the awareness. And so many of you, through the years when you came to meet with me, is that you would kept saying, this stuff keeps coming. All these teachers are telling me to be the awareness, but my God, this deficiency story, this not good enough, just keeps coming and keeps coming. And I'm sorry, but what I would say back then was what all the other teachers would say. Well, just rest as your true nature and see that you're not that. And that is wholly inadequate. Because what I didn't understand is that these deficiency stories and these really self-limiting beliefs that we really, really identify with, they're coming from the repression. See, so if I have to hold anger back, if I have to hold back what's true, then I'm going to identify with what's false. And as a child, we have to identify with I'm not good enough, or I'm unlovable, or some version of that, because we can't be ourselves. We can't just be angry. So I have to hold that back and then identify with something, false. Maybe even other emotions, so I don't have to feel that. See, so we teachers who are just saying rest and allow everything, what we're really doing is having you rest and allow everything that's safe. Essentially safer than what's buried. See the bypass? We're keeping you safe. That's not what you want, though, because then you get sick by not getting to the root. So you might temporarily feel better by hanging out with us, but in the long run, we're programming you to avoid what's buried and to think that there's no reason to even go. One follower came up to a teacher and said, well, I know that I have trauma. It's 2022. We now know. But the teacher said, trauma is an illusion. The root of suffering is an illusion. Yeah, maybe when you actually see that the root of suffering is an illusion, when you actually see that the mind-body connection around the anger repression is an illusion, but if you tell people that it's an illusion before they've seen that, you teach people to stay in repression. You teach people to suffer. You're teaching them to don't do anything that would ward off that disease that's coming from the repression. Don't do anything. That's dangerous. It's one thing not to do the work or not to process, but to tell people not to. In 2023, when we know trauma is running everything, at this point, it's just dangerous. You don't have to agree. That's a Scott Killaby adjective. But just don't bury your head in the sand around this. And my God, stop protecting the teachers that are bypassing. One of the reasons I'm doing this video is you guys send emails, my teacher, my teacher, my teacher. If your teacher's that clear, they don't need you to defend them. And really, you're not defending them. You're defending the trauma bond that was created there that's keeping you both safe. I'm getting too close to that with this work is what that is. That's not about your teacher. And by the way, what I say to people, now, I don't know if I want to go into all this. With this path, you have to bring all your relationships in, right? Because your trauma is running your relationships. So your relationship with your teacher or tradition, before you get to KI, needs to be brought in to see the extent to which you're using that to avoid and using your teacher to avoid. That's why I'm criticizing the teachers, is so that if you're on this path, you'll actually do the path. You'll actually bring them in to process that. Yeah. Many of you are like, I don't even know what the path is. What's he talking about? I'm not going to explain the path. That's not what this video is for. This video is to illuminate an issue that many of you may not know. Or maybe many of you do, but you can't really get your finger on it. So I can get my finger on it for you. So I want to talk about narcissism. It's a part of this path to talk about this thing. So what is this narcissism? It's taken me a long time as a teacher to nail this down about what really that is. And there are different types of narcissism. I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are two types I want to talk about, which is the grandiose narcissist and what I would call the covert narcissist. So the grandiose narcissist is like big energy, charisma, maybe confidence, but they repress negative emotions and they don't process them. That's the thing about narcissists that I've learned. That kind of mentality is basically just really self-absorbed and unconscious and doesn't think there's anything there to process or will not do it. But the grandiose has that energy. The covert narcissist doesn't have that big energy. We've repressed that anger and power and big energy, And so our narcissism, because I've touched closer to the covert narcissism. Our narcissism is more about the repression and holding on to victim consciousness, believing it. Just like the grandiose narcissist, we might get a supply of people that buy into it, our stories, our victim consciousness, and which insulate us from processing it. And we might even manipulate people into believing it because we don't want to deal with it. In any event, there's a kind of a narcissism at both ends there. What they have in common is a refusal to process their own stuff. The exact thing that I saw in the teachers and in myself earlier. This is why a lot of you guys have lobbed that criticism at teachers, narcissists. You're picking up on something. And so it's very easy to do. Because if I sit here and tell you and myself that I'm done, even implicitly, see, that's the touch of the narcissism right there. That's it. I'm beyond reproach. I'm not hiding anything or burying anything. I'm awake to my true nature. There's nothing to look at. I know my true nature. What do you mean? That kind of thing. Because you see, repression hides under that and drives that resistance. And so it can look like somebody's really clear, but they're being driven by unconscious repression, refusing to process stuff because essentially it's fear. But see, we hide the fear from ourselves, and then the spiritual thing takes over and says stuff. The only way to really know is for that teacher or that person to go down in their body skillfully and see if it's there. But it takes skill. And because it takes skill, a lot of the way that we get away with not doing it, a lot of these teachers, is by saying things like, there's no method. That was my thing in the beginning. No method. Because a method would imply time. It would imply ego and seeking. Well, now I know that that's just clever for the ego to adopt that belief system, because not all methods strengthen ego. Some of them make the unconscious ego conscious, which dissolves the ego, like KI. But if I have a wholesale belief that all methods are wrong, then that protects me. So slowly I started to just pick apart these belief systems that the non-dual teachers will say that are not belief systems. They'll say that they're just truth or whatever. They end up being belief systems that are protecting people. So like, you can't have a method. That sounds radical until you see that they're attaching to it. And by the attachment to it, there's an unprocessed emotion with it. And they don't want to feel that. So they believe they shouldn't have a method. And the problem with that then is there's a self-righteousness. The ego then defends that and then points outward and says, you have a method, right? So come on, you're staying safe. Yeah, some methods do bolster the ego and others deconstruct it. So discern instead of just believing stuff to stay safe. Discern between X and Y. I'm just trying to pick at things now so you can see the bypass, start to see it. Be with what is the bypass. Now that might sound crazy because it sounds like it's really radical. If I notice that I'm the awareness here and I'm just going to be with everything, here's the deal. You're not being with everything. That's a misunderstanding of trauma. It's to say that we're being, for hundreds of years, we've been misunderstanding the nature of our experience. We're not being with what is, we're being with what's safe, with what the mechanism within us has already filtered out for us. So those of us who came here bearing anger, we're not being with anger. We're not being with what is. We buried that. If you buried the hurt, you're being with everything but that. See, it's buried. Everything but what's buried is what you're resting with or being with. And what's buried is not safe. So you're resting with what is relatively safer, basically, than the true root of suffering. Therefore, you don't get to it, the true root, many of us, and then have gotten sick and scandals because we're touting this whole thing about being with what is and then keeping things buried. So what is the answer? Continue to be with what is, but do it in the right way. you have to reverse the repression and bring in what you're filtering out. Then you're actually with what is, and you can recognize the awareness at that point as being what you really are. Oh, here's another thing. So prior to identification, this is all the things that have to get decoded to actually be free. So what I've learned, you actually have to decode the non-dual teachings to actually be free. It's fucking ridiculous. But here it is. By the way, at this point in the video, I know there's somebody who's just like, I don't like this guy. This guy, fuck him. Well, you can do that if you want, but that's the mechanism right there. That's it. The one that self-protects into a trigger. And under your trigger, where you're making me wrong, is anger or hurt or fear repression that's protecting you. So there you go, another casualty. I'm just being honest with you. Like, if you're going to go out that way, you're probably not ready anyway. If you're going to go out with just disagreement from the mind and not willing to go look, see ya. But the rest of you following along, let me just take you further into this. The teachers that say you can recognize your true nature prior to identification. No, you can't. Not without reversing the repression, because it just takes a little bit of KI, not even a lot, to recognize that most of the core identities that we experience, you can't really even be mindful of them because they're not coming up as a story. It's a mechanism of survival. So, for example, holding the anger back, there was an identification with being good, peaceful, and kind, but it's not a story. I can't just sit there and say it's coming and going to me. I was identified with it. So I had to reverse the repression. Makes sense? To feel and allow the anger, and then the identity I have to be good became conscious because it was with the repression. But if I sit here and just rest as awareness and pretend like I can just see that I'm the awareness, when this repression is doing all this, that's the bypass. You can't point blank, you can't truly live and embody your true nature prior to identification without reversing the repression that produces those identifications. You can try, I did, but then what you do is the identities kind of get maybe quieter, but then you've got the repression in your body. And then that's when I got the 3 diseases, by not getting to the root there. And then, again, your main identification is buried. So if we're going to talk about awakening and what that is really, Ken Wilber says that this is the process of awakening universally. We're identified with something and it's unconscious. We believe it. We are it, or we think so. And then it comes into awareness as an object. And we see it and allow it. And then it passes away and we see that we're not it. So if you think about that's the process of awakening, but our main identification is buried, then we can't actually wake up because we can't, our main identification is not coming into awareness for us to see that we are the awareness. It just remains buried. Again, and so safe stuff comes up. Safer than that. And we sit and look and see, I'm not this, I'm not that. And we have this false sense that we're the awareness, but we haven't gotten to our main identification yet, which is another way of saying that the realization hasn't been embodied. We haven't gone down into the body to see where the core of the suffering is. The core of suffering is coming from that main identification, what you buried or repressed. Why do I call that a main identification? I had to come out of repression to know it. I had buried it. But when I came out of repression, I understood very clearly that that emotion of anger was the thing that I was most resistant towards. That was scariest. So ego is resistance. So the ego mechanism was most resistant of that emotion, and so it buried it because there was the strongest identification, resistance with that. But you can't know that when you're in repression. So there's a lot of teachers who don't know that their main identification is buried, and they're not taking you to the buried stuff because they don't know it there. And they're keeping you in this like safe pointing that doesn't get embodied by not getting to what's buried. Just the simple definition of awakening should make sense to you. That if you're going from being identified with something, it's an object in awareness, it passes, you're the awareness. Can't do that. If your main identification is buried, it stays there. It doesn't become an object in awareness. So you can't then say that you're the awareness. to which that comes and goes, because it's not coming and going. It's buried. And it's your main identification. Oh my God, if you understand that, it's a game changer. Because if you want to be earnest, right? What is awakening? If you have to contend with that. If you bury your head in the sand, then you still have the main identification buried. It doesn't change anything. I was just going to say a couple other things here. To the extent that you're reading me and saying, oh, well, he just thinks he's right. He's got the right way and the wrong way. That's a misread. So you're coming from that consciousness that's driven by the repression. So when we have trauma and repression, we have to divide the world up between like that and like as if everybody is either just trying to be right but that's not what's going on. As you go into the deeper states of realization, it isn't about being right. It isn't about having the path or the way. It's just about being earnest and honest about what has actually worked for me and what hasn't. It's not about attaching to the method and then building an ego around it, because the method actually deconstructs that. The thing that would attach to it, the repression and trauma. So don't misread this as if I'm just saying I have the best thing since sliced bread and I'm in an ego. There's nobody on the internet that gets on and says, I have the worst thing. I have the worst method or the second best method. Of course I'm going to say it's the best because it works the best for me. I've seen it work the best for the people that I've worked with. That's why I promote it. I have no problem. That's another thing with repression. So, God, it's like you can't be yourself. If I want to come on here and say, I got a great thing for you to help you, there are some people who say, stop being yourself. Don't promote. Don't see, because we're all in repression, guys. There's actually nothing wrong with promoting. It's just part of life. Like just talking about something. There's so much repression holding us back from just being ourselves. What I want to propose is a different way here. I want to propose a way which is what you have your eye on this ball, being your authentic, whatever that is, being your authentic self. That's how I healed. That's how Dr. Gabor Mate says that you heal, is by being your authentic self. That's what I want to talk about. And so the recognition of presence, the oneness, is something that happens all along the way as you're being yourself, because with KI, you're reversing the emotional repression that's responsible for all the identification, the separation. We're getting to that through the body without bypassing, see? So it ends up being an awakening path. But it's different. So if you come here expecting me to just point to awareness, well, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say that your urgency around wanting to recognize awareness, your seeking, is coming from the repression. I don't want to feel something. So instead of just pointing you to awareness, I'm going to show you what's driving it. I want you to transmute that repression that's driving the seeking and all the other forms of suffering, including diseases and chronic pain, if you're that earnest. Some of you will come to KI because of inertia. I mentioned it earlier. You don't have a disease or chronic pain. Maybe you have had an awakening experience, or you've been meditating, but you can't move. You can't start that website. You can't date. You can't go do this or that. Also repression. And we teachers don't talk about it because a lot of us are in repression. So we'll talk about waking up to our true nature, but then what is it that moves us? Where's the flow? So there is flow if you reverse emotional repression. But there's no flow if you just recognize witnessing presence, because your body hasn't been included yet, and that's where the trauma is. So when you include the trauma and repression, there's energetic flow. Flow being, that's a word that's hard to define. You just don't suffer anymore. There's no sabotage. Just living and manifesting presence, being with what is, awake to it all. There's nothing wrong with being interested in awakening or wanting to awaken. That desire to be free or enlightened or whatever, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not asking you to get rid of that. I'm asking you to see where it's coming from. So some of you will be coming to KI not because you've bypassed for many years. We'll get those people too. A lot of them actually. But some of you will come because you're at the beginning of your path and maybe you hear something in it that makes sense to you or that resonates. Regardless, even though I'm inviting people to send this video out to friends and who may not know about this work, I want you to be really careful about making this your path. Because there's a certain quality that you have to make KI your path. You don't have to be like someone who's been around the block. That would give you that quality. If you've bypassed a lot and you've gotten sick, for example, you already have that quality of earnestness, quite likely, because you're tired. You're tired of the bypassing and the suffering. But some of you that are new, you might not be tired yet of it. So be really careful picking this if you've still got some bypassing in you. Because I've learned that sometimes we just have to go suffer. We have to go avoid until we just find out that it doesn't work. So if you still think that somehow avoiding works, or if you still think that like just being pointed to presence is all you need, or some of the traditional viewpoints, you still have those around that you see from other teachers, this is not the path for you. If you're going to you have to be open to looking at everything that you're believing, including the spiritual stuff, especially the spiritual stuff. So if you're glomming on to any of the things that those teachers say to keep yourself safe, you have to be open to looking at that, no matter what it is. No matter how profound it is, if you're using it to stay safe and keep the emotions buried, you have to. So it's okay for people to come here who are new to the awakening or the healing path, but you have to be open to looking at the stuff that you bring from the bypassing teachers.